Welcome to Outback Outdoors. Make sure you like, subscribe, and click the alert to stay up to date on all our new videos.
What's up guys, Cory here from Outback Outdoors. Today we're making another video on mastering your camera. We're going over shutter speed. Now in videography, if you want to make the most cinematic film possible, shutter speed is a non-negotiable. There's a 180-degree rule for the shutter speed. That means that your shutter speed has to be double your frame rate. Now the standard is 24 frames per second, meaning your shutter speed needs to be at 1/50th of a second. Before we dive too much into explaining all that stuff, the reason for 1/50th at 24 frames per second is because that best replicates the motion blur that the human eye sees. So if you were to wave your hand in front of your face like this, like I'll do for you guys in front of the camera here, let's see, yeah. That little blur that you see following my hand, that's how your eye sees motion in the world. You see someone running, something flying. It's not crisp and clear. It's got a little bit of motion blur to it. 1/50th at 24 frames per second creates that. So when you're trying to make a realistic film, you want to try to aim for keeping your shutter speed at 1/50th, using your ISO and using your aperture to control light so you don't have to use your shutter speed to control light. Check out the aperture and ISO videos that we have linked here so you can understand what that does. So obviously, the longer the shutter's open, the more light hits it, and then the faster the shutter's open, the less it's open, less light hits it. So that's how that controls light. So the two that we typically film with are 24 frames per second with a 1/50th shutter speed, because that's how we see things in the world. But we have the ability to shoot in slow motion, which is 120 frames per second. You're capturing more information with more frames per second. So in order to have the appropriate motion blur there, we have our shutter speed set to 1/250th. So it's faster, lets more light in. Being conscious of that means you have to know that if you're making the jump from regular speed to slow motion, you're going to have to find ways to create more light, which is where that ISO and aperture video that are linked here really will help you out. So let's talk about regular motion blur, 24 frames per second at 1/50th. 1/50th is a pretty slow shutter speed, so it typically lets a lot of light in. And when you're perhaps trying to film something at f2.8, f4, and it's really bright, you're getting a lot of light coming in because your aperture is wide open. And if it's so bright that even at ISO 100 it's too bright, you're kind of out of options. There's two things that you can do here. The first one I'm going to go over is a lot of what we do in the field. And because we're talking to you guys about how to better film your hunts, let's talk about that first. Instead of doing the second option and adding some ND filters and stuff, you can just turn up your shutter speed. Shutter speed goes faster, letting less light in. In a run and gun, I'm crawling on the ground, I'm making the stock. This is kind of a necessity because we're trying to limit motion and noise and stuff. So I'm going to sacrifice some of my image quality, and I'll explain what you're sacrificing here. I'm going to sacrifice some of my image quality to crank up that shutter speed, get everything exposed correctly so it looks nice. In a nice, relaxed studio setup, our better option is using an ND filter. What an ND filter does, this one's a variable one, is I can spin it and it stops the light down. This is variable, so 2 stops up to 7 stops. As I rotate through it, it darkens my image. As I rotate back, it lightens it. And this allows me to be set at the appropriate shutter speed for 24 frames per second, have a nice wide open ISO, and darken my image enough that I can make sure it's exposed correctly. Now, having the ND filters at your disposal when you're setting up interview shots or trying to do some B-roll shots when it's not that high pressure situation of the animal's right here, I might spook it, is fantastic. But don't be afraid to just turn it up a little bit, darken that image down to capture everything exposed correctly, because too bright, a blown out image, you can't recover. I'd rather have my image quality sacrificed than unusable footage. Now I keep referencing here about it's going to mess up your footage a little bit. What it does, and we'll give you some examples here, is as I speed up my shutter, I get a little bit choppy footage. So we're gonna just film this right now, 24 frames per second, but I'm gonna turn up that shutter speed, and when I wave my hand now, notice that the motion gets a little bit choppy. It's not quite as similar to how your eye typically see things. Now, for the average casual viewer, that's not that noticeable. But if you're putting this on a big screen and you're trying to make it as cinematic as possible, it does look a little weird to your eye and brain, and you might unconsciously just be like, hey, this looks a little off or looks a little weird, and it's because that 180 rule was broken. Same thing with 120. If I get away from 1/250th for 120, I'm now catching too much blur, and I don't get that nice, smooth slow motion that you're used to seeing at 120 frames per second. And then now some of the new cameras, they shoot 240 frames per second, and my shutter speed has to be even faster, so there's even less light available. Most of us aren't doing that, so we're not even going to talk about it right now. As always, leave your questions and your comments below about how to improve your filming, and we'll try to create videos around that. Like and subscribe, and we'll catch you in the next one. Thanks.
Thanks for watching Outback Outdoors. We encourage you to comment below, and as always, like, subscribe, and click the alert to stay up to date on all our new videos.